Please put your hands together for Lisa Chase.
Thank you. So I am not a parking person. I'm a policy and design person. So I'm going to kind of introduce the concept of the policy considerations for microtransit, because we've heard a lot about the implementation and the great things about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, some of the even criticisms, going to use a couple of really nice case studies. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of the climate neutrality plan which the state of New York has, but I'm going to focus on New York City because from a policy perspective, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me because it mirrors a lot of European policies, and also the public transportation landscape is complex and really fascinating. So, also want to introduce demand responsive transport is really what we're talking about with microtransit. Microtransit is a component of the concept of making transport, public transit, responsive to the demands of the riders. So rather than dictating the system, this is when the subway runs, this is when the bus shows up, it allows the users to have a role in that. And you know, really what this graphic shows is this is not new. This is like electric vehicles. Electric vehicles were, well, they would have hit their heyday, turn of the 20th century, didn't happen. Now they're coming back and there's, you know, a lot of attention on them. But the same thing with demand responsive transport, microtransit. I mean, like back in, again, the turn to the 20th century, the jitneys, there were, you know, dial-a-bus systems, etc. 1980s, and I've talked to a few people today which kind of experienced the same lack of funding in their public transit systems in the 1980s. A whole lot of things got defunded, but kind of hurt public transit and also the demand responsive transport model. Now we're kind of fast forwarding. We've been talking a lot about technology and how that technology can then again improve transit systems, transport systems that respond to the demands of the riders. And it's this really cool convergence, I think. So in New York City, I mean, to me this is just fascinating because it's much more complex. There's a lot more moving parts than, I don't know, let's see, Port Jefferson, if they decided to introduce a microtransit system. Right now, it's really focused on the underserved boroughs and then the last mile, you know, that last mile connection. I don't think walking a mile is a big deal, but for people who are coming home from their evening commutes, and particularly the areas of New York City where this is first being implemented, a lot of people have been demanding better nighttime, late night transport because they work, you know, third shift or something, they need to get home. The subway doesn't go far enough and the bus system isn't serving them very well. And right now the funding model is Manhattan has congestion pricing now, right? This has been implemented in cities around the world. The intention, of course, is to reduce vehicles, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Very successful in London. I think they were one of the first cities to do this because their air was so filthy. So right now, the way the microtransit funding is working in New York City is that congestion fee is helping to fund the microtransit. So it's filling the transit gap. And there's, you know, kind of some questions since the climate neutrality plan also calls for some microtransit, but maybe as a gateway to better public transit, better subway systems, better bus systems. And I believe there may be a couple of electric vehicles that are being used in the microtransit system in New York. Mostly they're petroleum-based, and that has a lot of consequences for, well, is this helping or hurting our climate neutrality goals? So the New York City Green Deal is kind of an umbrella for a whole portfolio of policies that address energy efficiency, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right now the goal is 85% by 2050, and I believe that's against a 2005 benchmark. So there may be some questions about how aggressive that is, but it targets everything you could think of in the built environment. Commercial buildings, residential buildings, transit, electric vehicle charging, increasing the support for electric vehicles, mandating a certain number of electric vehicle charging stations, including fast charging, in any parking infrastructure, making new buildings build differently, renovating old buildings. And again, this is borrowing from European policy. There's a huge push globally for renovating old buildings, making them operate better, use less petroleum, use less electricity to heat, etc. And then of course New York City has, you've probably heard about this electrification plan. So the goal is, it seems far-reaching now, but the goal is to get all of the buildings off of gas, petroleum-based heating, and water heating, etc., and make them all electric. So there's questions about how is the electrical grid going to work, but that's the goal, and it includes buildings and again vehicles. So changing the transportation system, changing the buildings, changing that whole built environment. And it also calls for new mobility options and fewer vehicles. So if you're running a microtransit system, how is that going to impact me? So I'm that new mobility option, but am I creating more vehicles? And I'm potentially going to run into some policy hurdles if I can't help the city meet those goals. So also, another aspect, if you are, for example, supporting or running microtransit, you also have to think about New York City's energy performance rules. So let's say you're a garage that's supporting the vehicles, or you run a system and you have to store your vehicles, and if it becomes the rule, becomes the policy, that all of your microtransit vehicles have to be electric vehicles, well, now you have to figure out how your charging infrastructure is then going to feed into your energy performance, because every year, including garages, you have to measure and report all of your energy use. And you have to benchmark it against other buildings. And you have to be able to prove that you're getting more efficient every year, and you get an energy grade. But if you have to add to your electric vehicle charging, how does that impact your energy use? So it's a pretty complex picture. So it sounds very cool and kind of new and a great transport solution, introducing demand-responsive transport, microtransit, but there's a lot of moving parts that you have to think about, especially in a city like New York that has these overarching goals of reducing carbon emissions, reducing greenhouse gases, and also providing really great transport for its residents. Because, in New York City and Manhattan and all of the boroughs, there's a public expectation for good public transport. So if a city like New York or others is trying to get a sense of, so I have this microtransit system, what are the greenhouse gas impacts going to be? How does that fit into my overall goals? One of the first questions is really, well, is the demand-responsive transport system replacing a bus system? Is it complementing it? Is it filling in where the subway doesn't go? What's the landscape look like? Does it create more vehicles on the road, or does it reduce them? so that I'm helping meet the goals of less vehicles, right? Less congestion. And then what kind of vehicle types is it using? Is it diesel, God forbid? Is it just regular old petroleum? Is it electric vehicles? Maybe. And potentially, am I planning for autonomous vehicles? We heard a bit about that. And then really, the most important piece is, you know, you might have less vehicles on the road, you might have cool new types of vehicles, but if the miles driven increase, well then guess what? Your greenhouse gas emissions are going to increase. And that can sometimes be the case. You know, we were talking about Uber, Lyft, etc. Well, if you have a system that's just meeting people where they are, well, you can end up, if you're not pooling the riders, you can end up adding a lot of miles, and therefore adding greenhouse gas emissions, which isn't going to meet a city's climate neutrality goals, right? And so your microtransit system could start looking like part of the problem instead of part of the solution, which obviously can be a big challenge. And that's where we get to the challenges and some of the criticisms, especially in New York City. I know that when the proposal was put forth to introduce microtransit out in, I think the first implementation was Brooklyn or Queens. Well, the residents there had been asking for years, we want a subway extension. Why isn't the system reaching us where we need it? Hey, why isn't it responding to our demands? And so, you know, we were hearing a lot about the VIA system being part of the public transport system. It doesn't have to be. Some cities are doing this with private funding. And it's also a perception, right? So people may know that it's part of the public system, you know, maybe it's all on the same website, it's on the same app, but there's also this perception, right? Like, why is this VIA van system running where I've been demanding a better bus system, a better subway system? Who's paying for this? Is this costing me money? And is it really accessible to me, right? Is it going to be more expensive than the subway, more expensive than the bus? Can everybody figure out how to use that? Can everybody get access to it? Who needs access to it? Not just the people who might think it's kind of cool and easy to use, but the riders who really need it. And then also, it's kind of important to keep in mind that microtransit, and this even is kind of hinted at in the Green Deal program in New York City, it's kind of hinted at as being a gateway to better public transit, like maybe a link to extending the subway system. And there's even a proposal right now, it looks like it'll go forth, for a new line between Brooklyn and Queens to fill a big gap that's just been nothing. It hasn't been addressed. People have been demanding it. So you can kind of think about that as demand responsive transport, and then that leads to subway bus systems that are in fact responding to the ridership needs and the public demands. And it can also be kind of a cool gateway to an electrification plan. So we heard a bit about electric buses. Batteries are the big issue right now, but as the battery technology improves, it can be kind of a gateway to then an electric bus system that again is reducing greenhouse gases, helping meet the climate neutrality goals. And then another big piece that gets, you know, a certain amount of criticism, challenge is the funding sustainable? So is that congestion pricing in New York City? Is it gonna last forever? Is it going to be enough funding to support the system? Is the pricing, per ride pricing, sustainable? Are the operational costs sustainable? There have been cities where the microtransit provider pulled out because they weren't making enough money. And that's a big criticism for riders. Fantastic. So you finally gave me some sort of transit system where I've been asking for years. Is it going to be there next year, or will I be back to square one? And I still can't get to where I need to go. So a really nice study in Amsterdam that kind of encapsulates both the challenges, kind of some solutions, applications for the demand responsive transport model was in Amsterdam. So they took two neighborhoods that had not been really well served by public transport, kind of on the outskirts of the cities. Kind of similar to New York City, riders had been asking for years for better connectivity. So what they did was, in one neighborhood, they replaced the existing bus system with a microtransit system. They were vans, and at least one of them was an all-electric van. And then in the other neighborhood, they used the microtransit system to complement the existing system. So in the first one, they could do a really easy side-by-side comparison for all the factors they were going to assess, because they were going to look at ridership. Does it increase? Does it decrease? Can people use the system? Are they getting the transportation they need? They were going to evaluate the greenhouse gas emissions, the miles driven, et cetera, and how accessible it was to all the people who needed to use it. And accessibility, remember, is really about the accessibility of every group of riders who needs that system. So it's the elderly, it's people who may be disabled, it's young people, et cetera. It's the entire pool of riders in that area who need the transport. And so this was a really nice comparison they could do. In one, how well does it add to the system? Is it improving the system? And then the other, just this great side-by-side comparison. No bus system, now we have microtransit system, and see how they compare and see what the outcomes are and what the data shows us. And they also, in the study, they also compared a number of models around the world, including in the United States, which really kind of highlighted just how much disparity there is between how microtransit is implemented, how it's funded, and how well received it is. Because if you just kind of think about in a city like San Francisco, which is not well served by the train system, it's a very, very, very basic system. Most of the city doesn't get anything but maybe a bus system. If you introduce microtransit, it's probably going to be a win-win because they have nothing. So it will be well received, it will probably be well used. But again, in a city like New York, which is accustomed to long-standing, pretty well-funded, consistently funded at least, public transit, it's going to be a very different picture in terms of how people adopt it, how they use it. So, the takeaways, and the first one I think is really worth highlighting, is that the tech-enabled transport, it looks really cool, it's easy to use if you know how to use it, but what they found was that their ridership actually decreased, compared to the public system, by 28%. And the reason for that, what they found was that, at least in the neighborhoods where they were rolling this out, a lot of the riders were elderly. And either the system was too hard for them to use, trying to figure out how the app works on their smartphone, as opposed to just showing up at the bus stop, and I know the bus shows up, might not be as often as I wanted, but I know where it is. So there wasn't very good adoption from that population. And again, that's the point about accessibility. Is it accessible to everyone who needs it, not just everyone who can use the technology? Now again, using that system, using the technology-enabled system, can reduce the miles driven, which then reduces greenhouse gas emissions, etc. It does depend on how it's implemented. And again, no one-size-fits-all model. It's all over the place. But also, keep in mind, and they even recognize this in the study, well, we may have reduced miles driven because, oh, there were all those people who couldn't use it. So I think what this points out is the technology is a very useful tool, but especially if you're implementing this and you're trying to help people and give them the transit that they need, you need to think very thoughtfully, think very closely about whether that makes it accessible to everyone. Should there be different ways for people to tap into the system, and make sure that you get enough feedback from your users who you're trying to serve so that you are, in fact, making it very accessible. The other thing that they found was that the key to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in any microtransit system is to make them EV powered. That's really the clear takeaway. If that's your goal, you're trying to improve the transit options, and you're trying to improve your greenhouse gas picture, your carbon emissions, then using electric buses, electric vehicles, is really the best thing you can do. And so really the big takeaway from the study, and I think even what we heard from Vaya, is that the best use of the demand responsive transport model, the microtransit model, is to improve the public transit system, not to try to replace it. Because that's really what came through clearly in the Amsterdam study, was replacing wholesale the bus system that was there didn't work that well, but in the case where it could improve people's options and improve their access, then there was pretty high adoption. It was well received, and I think also this is such a great segue I got, I think, from Vaya, is what they really found, and I think the cases that have been pointed out almost anywhere this has been implemented, is using the data that the system can collect can be very, very powerful to improving a subway system, improving a bus system. So, it kind of flips the model on its head from the bus shows up when the bus wants to show up, depending on where you live. I live outside of Hartford, so sometimes it really does just show up when they feel like showing up. They're not super consistent. The subway goes where the subway's going to go. It doesn't run late enough at night, so it doesn't serve the people who are trying to get home really late. So using that data collection to monitor ridership, monitor when people need the system, that seems to be the real power of the whole, this whole model, this old is new again model of demand responsive transport, is to then improve the bus system, improve how the subway system works, and then also, hopefully, I'm a big proponent of this, use the microtransit model in areas where it's, filling the gap, where it's filling in for transit that people need, they've been demanding, to use it then as a gateway to e-buses, like the one in this photo. This is a really cool rendition. I can't speak for how well the battery lasts, but this is, full disclosure, this is Southern California, so they probably don't have to worry about it. But using the microtransit as a gateway to e-transit, electric buses, on-demand transit, and even a better subway system, because, for example, in parts of New York City where this is being rolled out, you know, using that data collection might actually be able to inform the city on how the subway extension should run, if in fact they respond to the demands of the ridership and say, okay, we're going to run the subway system to where you need it, and we've collected some really lovely data to better understand when it should run and where the stops should be. And so overall, to use the lessons to then improve public accessibility of the public transit system for everybody. And kind of keeping in mind who all your users are. They may be people who don't find it easy to download a smartphone app and be able to use it and get the system where they need it to be. And so overall, my big message, probably because I'm an advocate of public transport, is to use the model to then improve public transport in general and improve the greenhouse gas emissions picture. And that's that. Do I have any questions? Policy questions, because I love policy.
Okay. About a year ago, an op-ed columnist in the New York Times wrote a fascinating piece. I think his name is Farhad Manji.
Oh yeah, I have read him.
And he said, the holy grail of transportation is right before us. He said there's a public policy problem in the United States in that we're chronically underfunding bus systems throughout the country, and one of the problems is people that make public policy never ride the bus.
Excellent
My
point.
question to you is, he loved in that piece contrasted New York City versus London. Can you tell us about how London's system might have more benefits and be superior to ours?
Ooh, that's a big question. So the question is, how does the bus or public transit system in London compare to, I guess you would say, New York City or the whole country in general? So I think, so the big difference, for one thing, I mean, London has pretty strict, it's not just congestion pricing, they literally limit the number of cars that can go into the city. So that's the first thing to me. If you can't drive into the city, and I thought of this one day when I was going into New York City, and I meant to take the train, and then I got to the train, and I couldn't put my car anywhere, and good God, I ended up driving all the way. It was kind of a nightmare. But I said to myself, I shouldn't even be allowed to do this, because look at me, I'm sitting in the middle of the city, there's all this congestion, I'm adding to the congestion, well, this is kind of nuts. So, for me, that's the first thing. If you limit the cars that can go into the city, then I'm pretty sure the train system would have been better able, it would have had to better accommodate people like me to get there, so because they couldn't drive. And the other thing is, well, the cost of petrol, any place in Europe I've been, is kind of astronomically expensive, right? So it's the cheap fuel that enables, well, especially the policymakers, not to ride public transport, because you're right. Except for, I don't know, a couple of politicians in Washington, D.C. that like to talk about how they ride public transport, I'm pretty sure they're all in cars or they get driven or something. So yeah, I think that's the big difference, is limiting the number of cars and then the price of petrol so that people have to take the public system. And then that increases support for the public system and funding for the public system, right? People are going to keep voting for people who fund it and run it well because they need it. So that's my little soapbox. Thank you for the soapbox. Anything else? Yes?
Just an observation. Once you leave New York City, it's expensive. Public transit is expensive. It doesn't serve most right? In New York City, most people make some connection at some point during the year, even if it's just a day, a train out of the city to get back to Long Island or Westchester or whatever. But in our constituency, in Suffolk County, it's only reported about 25,000 people. There's 1.3 million people living here. It's a really small piece. Now, county doesn't spend a lot of money, it's millions, but it's single digits, 1-2% of their budget goes into that. But it's a hard thing for the average person to look and say, why do we spend these millions of dollars? What does it really do to us? What's the benefit I receive from this? I don't get a cost. I don't use the train system. So that's why funding, you're right, it's been underfunded forever. Funding is a challenge because elected officials represent everyone. But listen, in this society we live in, America, there's place, we've decided that we got to take care of everyone. There's people that can't get around, we need to help them get around. People that can't afford to get around, we need to help them get around. Public transit, trains, buses have been the backbone of growing this country forever, but our history is fading on all of us. So the challenge continues. We know we're all going to see tough government times ahead, and we're in for even bigger challenges. But the technology can help us better use these dollars. That's ultimately.
So to that point, I thought I'd use that as a launching point for maybe another soapbox. So you are absolutely right that in general, public transit in this country is not, I mean, anybody who's traveled at all on the train system, even in parts of Europe that are not as well developed as others, the public transport is still night and day from here. But what I would point out is, you know, part of the reason I talk about New York City is because there's a real differentiation between what happens in federal policy and what happens at the city levels and the state levels. I mean, the change right now in terms of energy efficiency policy, climate policy, transit policy, it's coming from the cities. And so an example, the West Coast, I grew up on the West Coast, most of the cities, oh my God, they used to have nothing. They had buses. What's really happening in cities, a number of cities that were basically starting from scratch, like Portland, Oregon, is they're building systems that, because they don't have any legacy architecture, and in Portland, Oregon, what they did is they laid most of the rail lines next to the highways because the land was already available. They didn't have to, you know, try to coerce landowners, etc. So they're building systems that are affordable. They're well funded partly because of city policy that said we will reduce the number of cars, we will reduce our overall carbon footprint, and therefore this is what we're funding and this is what we're building. It's a fantastic system. I mean, you can get anywhere in that city on a really well-run, fast public transit system. So that would be, I agree with you, I would say at the city levels, that's where the change is really bubbling up from. And that's why I like to focus on city implementation, because what really is happening right now is a lot of policy, including with transit, is starting at the cities, it bubbles up to the state, it may make its way to federal policy, but if not, it's still changing the landscape in regions of the country, you know, entirely apart from federal policy making. Anything else? Yes.
Lisa, I just had a question.
A provocative question.
No. Hopefully not. I just wanted to know about your use of terms, because like one of the things that's it's very difficult to talk about is demand response transit.
It's a mouthful.
Because there's like, you know, on-demand and microtransit and ride sharing versus ride hailing. So when you were using DRT and microtransit, was that including like Uber and Lyft style where it's only kind of like the single occupancy vehicle by proxy?
Right.
How are you conceptualizing those terms or defining them?
So I'm conceptualizing it as demand responsive to whatever the rider demands. So ride sharing would include that. And I believe in the Amsterdam study, they kind of talked about that, the difference. I mean, there's a big difference, as I think you even addressed that. There's a big difference between an Uber or Lyft model that maybe shows up at your house and one where you're kind of pooling the transit. But the thing is with, you know, the privately run systems like an Uber or Lyft, I mean, they probably don't even care if they're more efficient. So they're not using, it's very, very different using the technology like Via does to then figure out what the most efficient way to travel is, what the most efficient way is of grouping those riders. It's really night and day. I mean, really, I think, you know, Uber, Lyft, that's a ride-hailing, almost like a taxi service, right? And that's, you know, that's kind of how it started in places like New York. It was challenging the private taxis. So really, I think most commonly the terminology is used to think of a sort of public, quasi-public system that responds to the demands. And so that's why that was the big takeaway from the Amsterdam study, is use the technology, use the data you're collecting to improve the public transport for everybody. Anything else? No? Well, I see lunch.